In this video, you'll see Schluter DITRA installation mistakes, specifically 10 mistakes I see DIYers make. So I don't want you to fall into that category, and that's why I'm making this video, so you can avoid those mistakes and have a really great tile installation that lasts for decades. The first mistake is not choosing the tile before demoing your space. For example, it's really important to know your tile size before installing the Schluter DITRA. The reason why is if your tile is smaller than a 2-inch by 2-inch square or a 2-inch by 2-inch hexagon, you really shouldn't be installing it over top of DITRA. If you want to install a penny tile, for example, you can do one thing, and that is put Kerdi membrane over top of the DITRA so that the penny tile doesn't run the risk of cracking or breaking due to the small cutback cavities. So always choose your tile before you start your DITRA installation, and in fact before you start your demo. The second mistake DIYers make is not determining the floor joist span. The floor joist span is what prevents bouncing of the subfloor and therefore bouncing of the tile floor, and that prevents the cracking of the tile floor. So you can figure out the joist span by looking at the nail or screw pattern that's on top of the subfloor. So always find the floor joist span before you do the DITRA installation. In addition, the third mistake I see a lot of DIYers make is not inspecting the floor joist. If you have sloped floor joists, they should be rectified or fixed before you move on. And you can do that by sistering new 2x6s or 2x8s or 2x10s to the floor joist. Normally, I recommend consulting a structural engineer before you do this because the load of every home is completely unique and different. In addition, you should look for any big holes or notches in the floor joist and fix those as well before you move on. The fourth mistake DIYers make is not determining their subfloor thickness. The smallest subfloor thickness that Schluter recommends for DITRA is 5/8 of an inch. That said, I like using 3/4 inch plywood subfloors, tongue and groove if possible, because that way you'll reduce that bounce that I talked about before and you'll have a sturdy subfloor for the DITRA installation. On that note, when I install my 3/4 inch plywood subfloor, I use the right screw pattern. Normally I use 2-inch screws. That way 1 inch of the screw goes through the plywood and into the floor joist. And I space those screws every 4 to 6 inches along the perimeter of the room and 6 to 12 inches in the field. So the proper subfloor thickness as well as the proper installation of the subfloor with screws or nails is really important. The fifth mistake DIYers make is not fixing subfloor problems. For example, if there's a dip or a depression in the subfloor, I highly recommend using something like feather finish to fill that in and make sure that the plywood is nice and flat. Otherwise, if you are using a mosaic, that mosaic sheet will conform to that depression and you'll see a dip in the tile floor. So using something like feather finish really helps with this problem. The second thing is if you have a lot of thin set mortar on your plywood subfloor, I would grind that off. I use this rigid cup wheel to do that. Obviously, I wear a silica dust respirator and make sure that the room is ventilated properly. But you want to get that old thin set off of the floor so that you can then properly prep it for the DITRA. Ultimately, if your subfloor is sloped a lot, you can self-level it if the floor joists are in good shape, and that does require some prep, and I do have a nice full tutorial on how to do that. The sixth mistake is not choosing the correct thin set mortar. To simplify this, I recommend using Schluter All-Set, and the reason why is you can use this for both bonding the DITRA to your substrate as well as tiling over top of the DITRA. It really simplifies your installation. Also, there are specific mixing instructions for the Schluter All-Set when you're using it for DITRA, and I really like that a lot. And that does bring me to the seventh mistake, and that is not mixing the thin set to the correct consistency. Always read the directions. On the back of the bag, Schluter has specific water ratios for the DITRA. These do change from time to time, but the big tip I have for you here is to use cold, clean water, because the colder the water and the cleaner it is, the longer working time you'll have with the Schluter DITRA. So never use warm water because that's going to reduce the working time that you have with the thin set mortar. And that's not just for All-Set, that's for other thin set mortars as well. The eighth mistake that I see a lot of people make is not prepping the substrate. So for example, if you have any type of adhesive residue on the plywood, you want to prime that. And I do use Schluter Primer U for this. You can prime it and then within an hour or two, you can immediately set your Schluter DITRA. If you're worried about any kind of residue on the plywood, I highly recommend priming it. The other mistake in this category is people don't dampen the plywood or concrete. You always want to dampen the substrate so that when you apply your thin set, the thin set moisture isn't absorbed by the plywood or the concrete. So I always use a sponge to dampen down the substrate before I apply my thin set mortar. The next mistake is not choosing and using the correct trowel size. So for DITRA, you want to use the DITRA trowel. It's pretty straightforward. And what I do is I key the thin set first into the plywood or the substrate using the flat side of the trowel. The reason why I do this is that gives you a nice layer of thin set mortar and improves the bond strength of the entire system. The other mistake in this category is that a lot of people don't hold the trowel at a 45-degree angle. By holding the trowel at a 45-degree angle, I maximize the size of the notch, and by maximizing the size of the notch, I'm going to get a good bond between the DITRA and the substrate. I also apply the thin set such that my trowel notches are parallel to each other. This allows the thin set to collapse properly, the air to escape, and a full bond between the DITRA and the floor. The 10th mistake is not embedding the DITRA correctly. For example, I try to unroll the DITRA over top of the space where it's going to go. I don't move it laterally. I just unroll it over top of the thin set mortar. And then I compress it in 2 different directions using a float. This is where you can go wrong with the installation. I first compress the DITRA in one direction, then I go in the opposite direction using that same float. And what that does is really compress the thin set so that when I pull one corner of the DITRA up and I check the coverage, it's completely covered in thin set mortar. So there you go. Those are Schluter installation mistakes that I see a lot of DIYers make. I hope that you don't make those mistakes. Again, that's why I made this video. If you're doing a bathroom remodel and you need more tips and tricks, join our video library at homerepairtutor.com. I promise it'll definitely make your project a lot easier. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.